Okay, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. We've supported this conference for a number of years. It's my first time to be able to speak here, so it's quite an honor. Just a little bit about myself here. I farm on a family farm in the south central part of Nebraska. We're just kind of right in the middle of everything. We're almost the exact geographical center of the continental United States. So that's where we hail from right there. We've been no-tilling for more than 25 years there on the family farm. We're about 2/3 dry land and about 1/3 irrigated on what we're farming there. Traditionally, it's a corn, soybean, and on the dry land area it's a cereal type rotation. But over the last number of years, we've diversified quite a bit by adding things like rye, triticale, oats, barley, vetch, sunflowers, and buckwheat into our cropping rotation. We have been doing cover crops for 8 years now, and we started green cover seed in 2009, kind of in response to a perceived need that we saw for providing cover crop seed. And it's grown very quickly. Basically, what you're seeing here is our seed operation right now. In 2011, we farmed all that, and then we started building these buildings because that's kind of how fast the whole industry has grown. So we kind of have a unique position because we're farmers, so we know things from that end, but we're also now in the cover crop seed business, so we can see things from that end as well. We were very honored here just this past year. The Soil Health Institute commissioned a documentary to be made on soil health. The Living Soil, the series is what they're calling it, and there's going to be some additional things coming out. They've got some short videos online right now. So we were very blessed to be able to be part of this project, and they sent a film crew out last October, and I just wanted to show you a clip here because it's kind of interesting. But what they did is they wanted to get a picture. This is our combine. We're out in the field harvesting corn here. They wanted to get a picture of the air seeder kind of following the combine because we're really emphasizing the fact that you need to keep something living at all times and keep the soil covered and all that sort of stuff. So they sent this film crew out in October. Beautiful day, and I just want to show you this footage here. So it's a beautiful day in Nebraska. They sent this drone out, and this is kind of choppy on this computer. This is high definition drone video, and so I had the guys hook up the air seeder. I got in the air seeder and was taking it off thinking, man, this is going to be great. You know, I'm going to be in a film, going to be a movie star. Man, just, you know, this day couldn't hardly get any better than this. Can't wait to get out to the field. And things were looking pretty good. Okay, now, I know that almost all of you have done something like this, but probably hasn't been captured on high definition video. So I show that because pride really does go before a fail, and it verifies that we're real farmers out where we're doing, because that is not the only time something like that has happened. Anyway, this afternoon, what I want to do, I want to try to explain one of the most complicated systems in the entire universe to you, and that's this whole system of the soil. What's going on in the soil? What's happening under our feet? And I want to explain it in what I think is kind of a little bit of a unique way, because I'm going to do it by comparing it to another equally complex and sophisticated system, and that's the economy of a country. And I think as I go through this, you'll see there's so many parallels of how they work, and it's going to help you understand what's going on in the soil, because we all inherently understand what's going on in an economy. And if you remember from economics class in high school or college, and if you slept through it, I'll give you a little refresher here. There's 7 keys to a healthy economy, and I'm going to go through them real quickly, and then we're going to spend more time and we're going to apply them to the soil system and how it works in the soil. So first of all, if you're going to have a healthy economy, it has to start with supply. You have to grow something. You have to produce something. Because if there's nothing to sell, you have no economy. And so strong economies are very productive, and a high percentage of all the entities, all the people, all of the organisms in the economy are producing something. They're contributing something. And diversity is very important. And you're going to hear me say that phrase over and over again, that diversity is very important, because if you only are producing or supplying one thing, your economy is not going to be very strong. And then secondly, it doesn't do any good to produce or supply something if nobody wants to buy it. You have to have the demand side. You have to have people that want to buy things. And economies are strongest when the majority of people or organisms or entities within the economy are both suppliers and producers. And that's what makes a strong economy. And again, diversity is very important. And then thirdly, we need currency, because currency is what allows the producers and the buyers, the consumers, to get together and make quick and fast and efficient transactions between them. And to be good currency, it has to be universally desired and accepted. Everybody has to want it, and it has to flow. It has to have different forms and move back and forth quite easily. Capital is simply when you have excess currency, you can put it into capital. Capital is investments. It might be a savings account. It might be equipment. It may be land. It may be buildings. But you cannot have capital unless you have excess currency. You cannot have capital unless you have excess currency, because you got to have that currency in order to save it. And then energy and resources. Energy drives the system, but it's rather expensive usually. And then resources provide a base for our economic growth and expansion. Infrastructure allows the economies to grow beyond just the subsistence level. So if you want to be able to do more than just provide for your own family, you're going to need some infrastructure in order to grow that economy. And the two most important ones that we'll look at today are communication and transportation. And then finally, defense and protection, because strong economies are always going to be under attack by those who want to consume without ever producing, by those who want to take without ever giving. And so we need to protect our economy against that. And in order to do that, we have to invest capital in order to do that. You don't get free defense and protection. You have to purchase those services. So those are kind of the 7 keys to a strong, robust, healthy economy. And now we're going to look at how they fit into a healthy soil. How do these same principles apply to a healthy soil? Well, in our agricultural system, our economy is based on solar energy. It's based on the sun, the power of the sun. And so I lay that in as a backdrop, because everything else I talk about, as farmers, what we're really doing is we're harnessing the energy of the sun, turning it into products that we can sell. But then on top of the sun, on top of that solar energy, there's 3 main components to this economy that's under our feet when we're walking out through our fields. And of course we have the soil, because that's what it's all based on. Without the soil, we'd have nothing. We have to have living plants. That's the second part of this economic system that we're going to be talking about. But the third part, and the one that gets often overlooked, is the animals, or the biological life. And when I say animals, we oftentimes think of the larger animals like the cattle or the sheep or the hogs. But what we're really going to focus on today are not the larger animals, but the small ones, the fungus, the bacteria, the nematodes, the earthworms, things like that, because they're really, in conventional agriculture today, that's the part of the economy that has largely been overlooked. That's the part of the economy that's largely been kicked out of the system, and it's led to some consequences that we have to deal with. So these are the 3 entities within our economy that we're going to look at. So I'm going to go through these 7 principles now and see how they apply and see what's going on in the soil. So first of all, on the supply side, plants supply or produce carbon. That's critical. It's a very simple statement, but it's very, very important, because this chemical formula right here, this is photosynthesis. You've all learned it in grade school or junior high, but this is the most important chemical formula in the entire world, because it's the basis of all of our life. All of our food comes through this process right here. CO2 plus H2O with the energy of the sun, with the chlorophyll that's in the plant cells, and it turns it into C6H12O6, which is simple sugar, a glucose molecule, and oxygen. So it's taking a waste product, CO2, a pollutant, some people would say, but really it's plant food, plus water, and it's turning it into 2 really, really important things. One is oxygen, because we all breathe, we all need that oxygen, but the other one is this glucose molecule, C6H12O6. So what plants do is they're taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and also out of the soil, as we'll see later, and they're turning it into plant food, and then we're going to see how this carbon molecule moves throughout this economy and how it makes everything work. So that's really what plants produce. That's what they contribute to this economy, is carbon. Number two is the soil. What does the soil bring to the table in this economy? Well, first of all, they provide nutrients in the form of minerals. Now, over here on the right-hand side, there's a list of the most important plant nutrients. The first one is nitrogen. Just ignore that. That does not come from the soil. We'll deal with that later. Most all of the rest of them, and there's a whole list. This is just a partial list. There's a whole long list of all of the nutrients that plants need. The vast majority of them can be provided from the soil. It doesn't always work that way, and we'll see why, but the soil is made up of minerals that plants need. It also provides a habitat for the roots and the biology. It's a place for them to live, to grow. It supports them. And thirdly, and very importantly, it provides water storage, because plants need the water. Remember, from photosynthesis, CO2 plus H2O, you have to have water in order to make the system work. The soil holds the water. And the better your soil is, the more water it can hold. And that's really, really important, especially as you move west, out where I'm at, and further west. It becomes more and more important that our soils really hold all the water that it can, because the rains don't always come when they need to. Thirdly, the biology. What do the animals provide to the system? What does the biology bring to the table? Well, they produce nutrients through fixation. That's where the nitrogen is going to come from in this system. We'll look at that process later on. But they also help make nutrients available through cycling and through availability. And again, we'll dive a little deeper into the details of how these bugs, how these little critters can make all these mineral nutrients available to the plants. And then we'll also look at how they provide for defense and protection. It's a really cool system. When you look at how God designed this whole system with the plants, the soil, and the biology, and how it all works together in a natural system, it's really fascinating. It's really pretty cool. On the demand side, plants need nutrients and water. That's pretty simple. We're all farmers, we understand that. But plants also need services like protection and support and things like that. The soil needs carbon. You know, without carbon, the soil is really light-colored. It's very unproductive. It can't do much without the carbon in the soil, but it also needs to be protected, because soil is an amazing thing, but it cannot protect itself. And when the surface of the soil is exposed, it's either going to blow away or it's going to wash away. So the soil has to be protected by other members of that economy, particularly the plants, and we'll see that here. And then the biology, they're living organisms like you and I, so they have the same basic needs. They need a place to live, and they need food to eat. And we'll see how this all works together. So that's kind of the supply and the demand side. And in a strong human economy, one of the leading indicators of a really healthy, robust economy is low unemployment rate, because that means everybody's involved, everybody's got a job, everybody's contributing something, and when they have money from contributing, when they have that currency, guess what? They're going to go out and buy things. And so they're also demanders, they're also consumers. And so what you see in a strong, healthy economy is very low unemployment rate, and it's the same way in our soil. When we have strong, healthy soils, everybody is doing the job that they're supposed to do. Everything is working the way it was created to work. But what happens when something breaks, when something gets out of whack? And again, there's that diversity is very important, because again, in a strong economy, if everybody was producing one thing and everybody was buying one thing, we might have a really strong economy for a very short period of time, but there's going to come a point when that whole thing crashes. It's the same way with our soil. We need to have the diversity. So when things get out of whack, we have what we call, or at least what I call, agricultural welfare. And I want to be very honest with you. You know, I was honest. I show you our mess ups, you know, with the air seeder coming unhooked. And by the way, that wasn't my fault. just so you know, I've got plenty of people I'm blaming that one on. But the things that I'm going to talk about right here, we're not to the point where we want to be, but we're moving in the right direction. So here's what happens. When we externally provide for the plant, for this soil system everything that it needs from the outside, we weaken the economy. And here's what I mean. When we are giving the plant fertility inputs, when we're putting on all the fertilizer that it needs, and we're giving it all the crop protection inputs, all the herbicides, the insecticides, the fungicides, when we provide all that from the outside, we're basically saying the system can't work without me. And we're stepping in and we're providing welfare to the system. And what we're doing is we're essentially taking the biology, because these things that we're providing are services that come from the biology. But when the biology is no longer in our system because of the way that we farmed it for many, many years, the plants start to look sick. The plants start to look yellow. They don't grow very fast. So then we step in and we provide all of these things. And it can work for a while. Abraham Lincoln is kind of famous for saying, you cannot help men permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. Now, I want you to notice he does not say we should never help other people. We should. What he's saying is we can't help them permanently if we're doing the things for them that they're perfectly capable of doing themselves. And I think it's the exact same way with our soil. We're never going to grow our soils. We're never going to heal our soils. We're never going to have the best soils that we can when we continually provide everything that the soil and the plants can and should do for themselves. And so when we use too many fertility inputs and we use too many crop protection inputs, we're decreasing, we're diminishing the role that the biology plays in the system, and then we have to put more on. And it becomes this vicious cycle to the point where we just completely ignore the biology altogether and we just put everything on out of a jug. Now, where are we at in this whole system on our farming operation? Well, we're not where we used to be, but we're not where we want to be. We're somewhere in the middle. Our goal is we want to cut our fertility inputs by 50 to 60% in the next 2 to 3 years. We want to cut our crop protection inputs by 60 to 75%. We're going to do that in several ways. Number one, we're going to do what we can to enhance biology. Part of that's going to be through composting, through manure, through integration of more cattle into the land, more diverse rotations, things like that. So we still provide some welfare to our system, but not as much as we used to. We need to allow the system to work the way that God created it to work, and that's the biology. The biology is the piece that's missing from most farming operations. The soil is still there. It's not as good as it used to be, but it's still there. We're still planting plants. Those things are still there. But what's missing by and large is the biology. And that's where we get into this vicious cycle of having to provide all the things. Okay, moving on, currency. Remember I said currency is important so that the producers and the consumers can transact. They can buy and they can sell and they can make it all work. And it's important that it's universally desired and it's exchangeable. So back in the day, you know, when beads or cattle or something were used, that was sort of a currency, but it was not real efficient because you had to argue over the value of it. You don't argue over the value of a dollar bill. It's worth $1. You know, or when you write a check or use a credit card, $1 is $1, and it's pretty efficient in how that works. In our soil system, we have the perfect currency, and that's carbon. Now, let me show you how this works, because carbon is the ideal currency to drive this whole economy that's going on in the soil. Here's photosynthesis again. The carbon molecule up in the atmosphere in CO2, it gets converted to carbon in that glucose sugar molecule that's in the plant. It's in the plant leaf tissue. We're going to kind of watch and see what that does. But that carbon molecule becomes the currency now that plants will use to purchase things. They're going to buy things within this economy by using that carbon molecule. So here's what happens. Carbon is important because it allows the plant to purchase goods and services, and everything else in the economy wants that currency. So plants, through liquid carbon exudates, and I'll show you a picture of that here in just a little bit, but it's putting carbon into the soil through root exudates, the carbon payments to the biology, and then the biology in exchange is providing plant services. It's sourcing things, it's delivering things, it's protecting things. I've heard experts like Christine Jones from Australia have said that as much as 50 to 60% of all of the carbon that a plant produces through photosynthesis, as much as 50 to 60% of that is not used to grow the plant tissue. It's not used to grow the roots. it's leaked out through the roots into the soil system. It's actually given away or traded or used to purchase things from the biology. And the healthier your soil is, the more important that is going to be. So a plant is not going to give that away without getting something in exchange. That's why it's an economy, and that's why the biology is providing things in exchange for that carbon. Carbon is essential to all life. You and I were about 19% carbon if you looked at it on a weight basis. Carbon can form over 10 million different compounds. It's very versatile. It can be in many, many different combinations. Carbon is the most important, but it's the most overlooked of all plant nutrients. Who sits down with their agronomist and talks about a carbon plan for your next crop? Nobody does. But you talk about nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and all these other things, but carbon is the most important. It's the one that's needed in the largest quantities. Carbon is the main food source for all of the soil biology under the soil. When we have more carbon in the soil, it normalizes soil pH. So it takes out some of the negative effects of having real low pH or real high pH. When you have lots of carbon in the soil, it can help buffer that. It increases your cation exchange capacity. It increases the availability of the good nutrients that plants need, everything from phosphorus and calcium and potassium, all those things. But it reduces the availability of the harmful ones like sodium and aluminum, which can easily become toxic in toxic levels. Excess carbon in the soil will help reduce that availability. So everything that carbon is doing is helping that plant to grow. Look how it's the perfect currency. It can be collected through photosynthesis. And again, think about carbon in a dollar bill. It can be collected through photosynthesis or earned. It can be spent because it's going to be traded to these soil organisms. It can be saved through soil organic matter. And it's desired by all members of the economy, just like the US dollar is in our economy. It has different states even, just like we have cash, we have credit cards, we have savings bonds. In our plant economy, we have carbon dioxide, which is the gaseous form of the currency. It's floating around all over here. Every time we exhale, we're putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. Liquid form is liquid carbon. It has to be in the liquid form in order to move up and down through plant tissues. That's how it moves. And then the solid form, when it gets combined with other minerals and made into organic matter, or when it becomes part of our flesh or plant tissue, that's the solid form of carbon. And it easily exchanges forms, and it can move from one to the other very, very easily, just like we can write a check, or we can pull out and pay cash, or we can use a credit card. So it's the perfect currency for this system. And then when we have excess, we can start to save it. Okay, we can start to save it because capital is saved or stored extra currency. And we need that if we're going to grow and be stable. In our plant economy, that's called soil organic matter. When we have excess carbon, which is the currency, now we can start to save it in long-term investments. We can accumulate it, and we can start building organic matter. Now, we could spend the whole rest of the day just talking about why organic matter is important. There's other people much smarter than I that can tell you that, but I think we all understand that that's one of the most important things about the soil. How much organic matter does it have? It's very, very important. In a capital-rich economy like the United States, the economy is productive, it's stable, it's resilient, and it's efficient. And it's the same way with high organic matter soils. They're very productive, they're very stable, they're very resilient, and they're very efficient. We have some ground that we farm that was grasslands for most of its life. It hasn't had 100 years of farming history. So when we broke them out and started farming them, the organic matter levels were 4 and 5% instead of 1 and 2%. And that piece of ground that's 4 and 5%, it's always the last one to burn up in a drought. It's always the last one to get a disease or have insects attack it. It's always the most productive because that organic matter is making the economy. It's driving the economy because I've got that saved up currency. I've got that stored up currency that can be used to help out in the tough times. Rattan Lal from Ohio State University says soil organic matter generates and regulates every ecosystem service that sustains life on Earth. It's producing the food. It's producing the oxygen. It's a pretty important thing. And as a nation, as a planet, we've lost more than half of the organic matter that we had in these soils probably 150 to 200 years ago. So we need to be about the business of rebuilding what has been lost. You cannot accumulate capital if you don't have excess currency. If you don't have enough money to pay your bills, you're not going to be able to go out and buy a savings bond. You're not going to be able to grow your savings account. And think about this. You can't build organic matter in your soils unless you have excess carbon. So if you are farming and you're just growing corn and soybeans, and that's all you're doing, the corn and the soybeans are going to produce enough carbon for themselves. But there's nothing left over. That's like if you have a job and you're living paycheck to paycheck, you can get by, but you're never going to get ahead. So when you're farming and you're not very diverse in your rotation and you're not using cover crops, you're really living paycheck to paycheck. And you're kind of on a razor's edge and you're always a little nervous and you're only one bad thing away from really, having a bad go of it. So we can't increase organic matter without excess soil carbon currency. And that's why cover crops are so very important. Because when we use cover crops, now we're harnessing more of the sun's energy, we're producing more carbon, and most importantly, we're not exporting any of that carbon in a semi-truck. We're not harvesting it with a combine, we're not hauling it away in a hay bale or in a grain truck. And so that carbon that the cover crop produces cycles back into the soil, and we really see big increases in soil organic matter levels when we start using cover crops. On our own farm, when we started no-tilling, our farm average soil organic matter level was about 1.6, 1.7. After 20 years of no-till, we had raised that about a point to about 2.6, 2.7. After 7 years of using cover crops, we raised it another 3/4 of a point in only 7 years. By using cover crops, we're introducing excess carbon into the system. Now we can start saving, we can start investing. Okay, energy and resources. Energy drives the system. You have to have energy to make things work, but it often is expensive. In our economy, the energy comes from the sun. So think about this. As farmers, we're the luckiest people in the world. I don't understand why we're not all filthy rich, because our number one thing that we need is carbon, and it's free. The energy source that we use is the sunlight, and it's free. Okay, the government hasn't figured out yet how to tax us on those things. They might eventually. All this stuff is free. We should be filthy rich. Well, there's lots of other issues. But our energy comes from the sun, and all we have to do is collect it. And it's so much cheaper to plant a seed, and up pops these cool little solar collectors. Now, by our booth upstairs is a solar energy booth, and so they've got some cool solar panels, and those are great, but they're far more expensive than the solar collectors that, as farmers, all we got to do is go plant seeds. And so all we need to do is plant seeds to harvest this solar energy to drive the system. But when we're not planting cover crops, our fields, that sunlight is hitting bare soil. That their sunlight is not hitting a green leaf. That's wasted opportunities. That's wasted energy when we don't have something out there to collect that. A healthy soil economy should not need significant purchased energy inputs. And when you look at your crop budgets at the end of the year or beginning of the year, if you're projecting, when you look at how much you spend on energy, you are not only looking at diesel fuel and propane and things like that, but for many of us, our number one energy expense is nitrogen fertilizer. Because, and I'll show you in a little bit why nitrogen fertilizer costs so much in energy. But I can say that a healthy soil economy does not need significant purchased energy inputs, because for thousands of years, we had very, very healthy, robust soil economies long before we were ever here to purchase energy, to put nitrogen on, to buy diesel fuel and do all that. The native prairies were very, very productive with no significant purchased energy inputs. Now, on the resource side, the number one thing that we need is carbon. Number two is nitrogen. We have to have nitrogen. Now, I want to point out that this is a pie chart of the atmosphere. And this little black sliver at the top there represents how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. It's between 0.03 and 0.04% carbon dioxide. Very tiny sliver of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, yet that provides the majority of the carbon that our plants need. Nitrogen, on the other hand, is that big red. 76.5% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. Now, we spend $0 putting carbon into our plants. We spend billions of dollars putting nitrogen out for our plants. Why? Well, I've got good news and I've got bad news for you. Okay. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is held as dinitrogen. It's two nitrogen molecules that are very, very strongly held together in this triple covalent bond. The good news is we're not dead. Because if it wasn't in that form, we would all be dead. Because you could not breathe active nitrogen in those quantities and live. So the only way that we can live by breathing in that much nitrogen is that nitrogen molecule has to be inert. We breathe it in, we breathe it out. It doesn't change one bit. It's the same nitrogen coming out as went in. It's strongly, strongly held. That nitrogen cannot combine with anything else in our bodies. That's the good news. The bad news is, because of that, plants can't use it either. A plant can take it in through the stomata just like carbon dioxide, and it pushes it right back out. Because that nitrogen molecule cannot come apart to bond with anything in that plant, so the plant cannot use atmospheric nitrogen in any way, shape, or form. So that's the good news and the bad news. We're not dead, but we also don't have nitrogen for our plants. So what we have to do, if we want to get that nitrogen in for the plants, we have to pull the nitrogen molecule apart. And it's extremely energy intensive to break that triple covalent bond to get those pulled apart so it gets fixed or it gets plant available when it's combined with hydrogen or oxygen. And kind of as a result of World War II, the lead up to World War II, they learned how to break that bond of atmospheric nitrogen, and they could make reactive nitrogen, which is one of the main things that they used in making bombs for the war. Timothy McVeigh, who bombed the Oklahoma City Federal Building, that was ammonium nitrate is what that bomb was made out of. It was nitrogen, and it was fertilizer. And so after World War II, when we no longer had to make all the bombs, they converted all these nitrogen factories over to making commercial nitrogen for agriculture. And it was great because we could put nitrogen on our soil. Our crops grew way better, but it's very, very energy intensive. It takes a lot of energy to pull that nitrogen molecule apart. And so that's why I say when you look at your energy budget, for most of us, for many of us, the biggest energy expense that we have is the energy that it took to make that nitrogen fertilizer. But guess what? In a natural system, what it takes man millions and billions of dollars and all this intensive energy to do, God created these teeny tiny little bacteria that we can't even see, and they can do it just fine. So we have rhizobia bacteria that can grow on the roots of legume plants. So if anybody ever says, well, legume plants can make their own nitrogen, that is not true. No plant can use atmospheric nitrogen. But legumes will allow the bacteria to form these colonies. And essentially what they're doing is they are building nitrogen-producing factories on the roots of these plants, and they will break that dinitrogen bond. Don't ask me how they do it. That science is way above me. But they are breaking that nitrogen bond, and they put the nitrogen into a form that the plant can use. But guess what? They don't do it for free. There's no such thing as a free lunch in the soil economy, just like the human economy. They don't do it for free because as cool as rhizobia is, and they can break this nitrogen bond that takes us millions and billions of dollars to do, they can do it very easily. They cannot produce their own food. They would starve to death because they can't produce their own food. They are completely dependent upon that plant for all of its food. And what do they eat? They eat carbon. And that's why carbon is that perfect currency, because the plant is saying, I will give you some of the carbon that I'm producing if you will give me some of the nitrogen that you produce. And it's that symbiotic relationship that allow legume plants to grow very, very well with no outside nitrogen inputs because they're purchasing the services from the bacteria in exchange for that carbon. But guess what? Plants aren't stupid. They're not going to spend that money if they don't have to. So if you have legume plants and you put fertilizer out there for them, guess what? They're going to take the handout. They're going to take the welfare, and they're not going to give their carbon away to the bacteria because they don't need to. They've got nitrogen in the soil already. So that becomes an issue if you've got nitrogen in the soil. If you've got carryover nitrogen from your corn, your beans will take all that up before they ever give carbon to the bacteria, and those bacteria will not produce the nitrogen until they get the carbon. It's an economy. These things aren't stupid. Plants aren't stupid. They may kind of be lazy, but they're not stupid. But it's not just rhizobia bacteria that are doing this. There are other organisms out there, and as farmers, we're all familiar with rhizobia. We all grow legumes. We know the power and the value of that. But there are other things out there like Azospirillum, Zotobacter. These are other bacterial organisms, but they are not dedicated only to legumes. Because these rhizobia, for whatever reason, and again, I don't understand all the science to it, but they will only associate, they'll only do this with certain legume plants. These guys, they don't care. They're not that picky. They can take atmospheric nitrogen, they can break it apart, they can make it available to plants, and they will sell it, they will trade it to plants, again, in exchange for carbon. But they can associate with grass plants, they can associate with broadleaf plants. They are non-specific. So why do we have to put any nitrogen on our corn at all? Why don't we just have lots of these little guys out there? These guys aren't nearly as efficient as rhizobia. Rhizobia, if you're growing 80 bushel soybeans, that probably takes anywhere between 400 and 600 pounds of nitrogen to grow that big a soybean crop. That's huge amounts of nitrogen, and that is all provided from the rhizobia, because you can grow 80 bushel beans and put no commercial fertilizer on whatsoever. The rhizobia are doing that. That's huge amounts. These guys are only going to produce 20 to 30 pounds an acre. So you're not going to grow much of a corn crop on 20 to 30 pounds an acre, but think what that would do for a cover crop. Think what 20 to 30 pounds would do for a grazing crop. Think what 20 to 30 pounds would do for the native prairie. That's why that prairie system was so efficient at doing what it did, because we weren't exporting all of that. When it takes 400 to 600 pounds to grow a crop of soybeans, 80% of that is leaving the field in the truck. 80 to 90% is leaving the field. So these guys will produce nitrogen and exchange it for carbon to these other types of plants. But they still have to trade it. They still have to associate with a plant in order to do that. And it's not going to happen if we have excess nitrogen in the soil. Okay, so we've got carbon, we've got nitrogen, and then there's all these other mineral resources. Here's the chart that came off the internet of all these different things that plants need: calcium, magnesium, sulfur, iron, manganese, zinc, copper, and so forth and so on. All of these things, we may call them trace minerals or micronutrients or something like that. And oftentimes, we'll get a recommendation from the soil lab or from the agronomist, and they'll say, well, you need to put this much copper on, and you need a little bit of zinc, and you need this and that. Well, who was putting that on before we got here to do it? No one. It's in the soil. What we have to do is we have to unlock it. We have to make it available, because the soil is made up of these minerals that most all of the plant minerals, or all the minerals that a plant needs, are in the soil, but the plants can't get them. Just like plants can't get the nitrogen from the atmosphere, they can't get the minerals out of the soil. It has to go through the biology. That's the way God created the system, is that everything goes through the biology. When we take the biology out of the system, now we have to provide the welfare, and we have to give it to them. Look at this picture. This is a highly magnified picture of a mine in, I believe this is in China. And what you see growing through there, it kind of looks like a plant root. That's not a plant root. That's a fungal hyphae, and it's actually drilling through solid rock, and it's extracting iron and magnesium out of that rock. There was an article a few years back in Scientific America. I love the title of this article. It says, "Mycorrhizal fungi run the largest mining operation in the world." Very, very cool. This picture right here, this is a highly magnified piece of feldspar. Just think of it as a tiny little grain of sand, highly magnified. And you see those channels running through there? Those are actual voids. That is tunnels that have been cut into solid rock, again, not by a plant root. Plant roots cannot do this. They cannot do that. This is mycorrhizal fungi. It excretes the right types of chemicals, and it will chemically drill into solid rock. It dissolves the minerals that are in there, and it extracts it out through the hyphae, and then guess what it does with it? It sells it to the plant in exchange for carbon. Because again, as cool as fungi are, and they can drill through solid rock, they cannot produce their own food. And without that association with the plant to get the carbon that they need to live, they would die, or they would go dormant. They would spore up and you would not see them. So again, the plant can access all these different trace minerals, all these micronutrients, in exchange for some carbon payments. This is what it looks like. This is a highly magnified root. The little black round things that you see in there, those are the arbuscles that are actually growing inside the root, and then out through the cell walls of the root, these little hyphae extend, and that's what goes out and explores the soil and brings these things in, all of the minerals in. Jennifer Fraser is the author of this article in Scientific America. She says, mycorrhizal fungi, they mine the soil not just for the basic things like nitrogen and phosphorus, but the hard-to-come-by things, the trace elements. She goes on to say, oddly enough, many soils are rich in important nutrients, but they are often locked up in a physical form, which makes them unavailable to most plants. When you get a soil test back, it's not telling you how much phosphorus is in your soil. It's telling you how much phosphorus is available to the plant. That's why it's always very, very low normally, unless you've been putting a lot of manure on. It's not going to tell you how much iron or boron or copper is in the soil. It tells you what's available to the plant. And so the biology can make many of these available to the plant that the plant can't get by themselves. All right, moving on. Infrastructure. Infrastructure is needed if you're going to grow your economy, and the two most important infrastructures are transportation and communication. We know that these are important because it is a very time-honored, time-tested strategy that when you're in war, one of the most effective things you can do to your enemy is try to disrupt and destroy their infrastructure, primarily transportation and communication. And so you will often see this in a war. You'll see you blow up your enemy's bridges, their airstrips, their roads, their rail lines, anything like that, so that they can't move things, they can't travel. You will also see them target communication infrastructure. You know, back in the day, they would have targeted the telegraph lines. Now they would try to hit, internet communication centers and things like that. It's a very effective war strategy. So when I was putting this talk together, I was thinking about the transportation infrastructure of the United States, because we've got the best transportation infrastructure of any country. If you look at the interstate highway system, they are very large roads that can move immense amounts of goods back and forth very quickly. And so that's a great transportation infrastructure, but there's a lot of areas that aren't real close to an interstate. Like we're kind of between I-80 and I-70, and I've got to go 50 to 60 miles to get to an interstate. So it's good, but I've still got to get there. So when you really look at the transportation infrastructure of the United States, you have to also overlay the paved highway system. Because now there are very few areas that have very dense population at all that is very far from a paved road that will take you to a bigger road so that you can move goods and services back and forth very easily. And that's why the United States, by and large, has been the strongest economy in the world. And when I looked at that, I thought, that's exactly what's going on in the soil. Because this plant on the left, that's the interstate highway system. This is the plant roots. Plant roots can move goods and services, particularly liquid carbon. It can move it very fast, very efficiently. They're the big conduits. It's the interstate highway system. But look at how much soil is being touched by those plant roots. Not much. Okay? They're doing a very good job of where they're at, but they're not at all the places it needs to be. So when you have the mycorrhizal fungi, which grow from the roots and extend out through the soil, now we're much more efficient at getting the things to the interstate highway systems to move it up and down, up to the plant, down to the roots, wherever it needs to go. So that's what we want to shoot for in our soil systems, is we don't just want the big roads, we need all the small roads to get stuff to the big roads. Mycorrhizal fungi, there's another picture of it, highly magnified. You can see all the hyphae coming out of the plant roots and going out to explore the soil. But they transport phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium, and all these different things are being transported through mycorrhiza, and in dry times they help transport and supply water as well. So when you have a crop that is highly colonized with mycorrhizal fungi, it is much more drought tolerant than a crop that is not. Transportation infrastructure is kind of like, if you're farming and you don't have mycorrhiza, it's kind of like farming without having roads, rail lines, or ports. There's huge potential, but it's severely limited. About 8 years ago, I was privileged enough to be able to go with No-Till in the Plains to Brazil on a kind of a no-till study tour. And the part of Brazil that we were at is right in the center there. Mato Grosso is the state in Brazil. It's right in the middle. Huge area of farming. And you see these pictures like this, where they may have 20 or 30 combines out in one field, because that farmer has 100,000 acres of soybeans. And that area of Brazil gets 70 to 80 inches of rain a year, and it's warm enough 10 to 11 months out of the year to grow something. So they're growing 2 to 3 crops every year. Now, they told us that in this state of Brazil, there is more land that they could be farming, but they're not, but they could bring it into production, more acres than the entire area in the United States that's growing corn and soybeans. Almost 200 million acres they could bring into production just in that state. It's very underdeveloped. Why aren't they farming all that? Well, this is what their roads look like. They are right in the middle. See where they're at? Whoops. They are landlocked. They don't use hardly any corn and soybeans domestically in Brazil. They don't feed cattle in Brazil. The cattle are all grass-fed, so they export everything. It's a 3-day trip with a semi from Mato Grosso to the port, one way. So think about what that would do to your harvest. Every semi you cut, 3 days out, 3 days back. Not very efficient. So that's why they haven't brought all that land into production, because they can't get rid of what they've got. There's no rail line that comes from that area to the ports, to Rio de Janeiro. There's no rail that connects them. If they ever get that, we're really going to be in trouble, because think of what they could produce if they had infrastructure. Now, mycorrhiza aren't the only infrastructure in the soil. Earthworms are a huge part of the transportation infrastructure, and there's other biology too. We just don't have time to talk about them. But I want to mention earthworms, because when you have a healthy earthworm population, look at the holes that they're leaving in your soil. As they burrow up and as they go down, they leave these channels. These channels are huge conduits for getting water into your soil, for getting oxygen into the soil. They're also pulling down surface residue down into the soil from the surface, and they're hauling biology around too. As they eat some of the residue from up on top, they'll crawl down in the soil, they'll poop it out down here. Any bacteria or fungus that was on the residue at the surface now just got transported down lower. So there's kind of the public transit system of the soil. They give lots of different things rides, and they move lots of things around. So earthworms are hugely important. And if you're farming and you have very few earthworms in your soil, you're doing something wrong. You got to figure out what to change to get the earthworms back. Because of all of the biology that we can talk about, these are the one thing that we can see. We know if we have these guys or not without having a microscope, without having an $80 soil test. You can go out and see if you've got earthworms. And if you don't have them, you don't have very healthy soils. The area right around the roots, so we're going to move on to communication now. That was all transportation. Communication, the area right around the roots is where all this communication is happening. So if you've ever seen the Chicago Board of Trade, it looks like absolute chaos, okay? There's people yelling and shouting at each other and doing hand gestures and things like that, but there's a tremendous amount of communication happening, and it's communication about buying and selling. And that's kind of what I envision this area right around the root, the rhizosphere they call it, is happening, because what's happening is the plant is communicating to the biology what it needs. And you know, I told you that the mycorrhiza can bring in everything from water to nitrogen to phosphorus to boron. Well, how does the mycorrhiza know what the plant needs? How does it know what the plant wants? And the answer to that is it knows what it needs or wants by the different chemical compounds that it's leaking out through the roots. Remember I said that carbon can form over 10 million different chemical compounds or different compounds. It will leak out a different one when it's calling for nitrogen. It'll leak out something different when it wants boron. It will leak out a totally different one if it wants water. So plants are communicating through the biology by different types of root exudates that they leak out into the system. And so here's a picture. My friend Jimmy Emmons from Oklahoma took this picture with a proscope. I don't know if you've ever seen a proscope. It's a little $150 microscope that you can attach right to your iPhone. This is a picture with an iPhone, and it's really cool. Now, this is not mycorrhiza, okay? I don't think you can get enough magnification with an iPhone to get mycorrhiza. These are root hairs coming out of a main root, but the thing that's fascinating about this, look at all of the little droplets on those root hairs. That is liquid carbon exudates that plant is pushing out, oozing out into the soil. The biology is eating that, it's reading it, it's communicating, and each one of those may be calling for something different. And the bacteria, the fungi in the soil, they can interpret that and they can read that and they can know what the plant's calling for. So they know if the plant is wanting manganese or cobalt or copper, because it will signal it with different types of root exudates, and each one of those is communicating something different. And so the carbon can be formed into carbohydrates, into sugars, into proteins, into fats, into lipids, into oils, all these different compounds, and they're signaling different things to the biology. But plants also communicate other ways. It's really fascinating. I don't understand this very well, and I always run out of time, so I don't have a lot of time to talk about it. If you're interested in how plants communicate, you should go to YouTube and search for Dr. Jack Schultz. Dr. Jack Schultz from the University of Missouri has some really good information about how plants communicate. But real briefly, in a couple ways, plants can communicate through their root systems and also through the air. And the way they do this, they did a study where they took two plants, they infected one plant with aphids, and when a plant gets infected with aphids, it starts changing biologically what it does inside the plant to help defend itself against aphid attack. When they infected one plant, it started changing. When they noticed the neighbor started changing before it ever got aphids, they started thinking, how does that neighbor know that there's aphids around? Well, the infected plant is communicating to its neighbors in two ways. One is through the root system. Now, a soil microbiologist told me that plant roots won't actually physically touch. They won't actually physically touch each other, so they cannot communicate root to root. What has to happen if they're going to communicate through the root system, they have to be tied together through the mycorrhiza. Because that mycorrhiza can grow from this plant, it can extend its hyphae out, and it will actually grow into the other plant root. So now you've got the roots tied together with the fungus, and you can have a legume plant and you can have a grass plant. Not only can they communicate, but they've identified plants exchanging nutrients with each other. So they've seen legume plants send nitrogen molecules over to a grass plant, and they've seen the grass plant sending phosphorus over in exchange. That's why when we do cover crop mixes, we like the diversity, because there's things like this going on where plants are cooperating with each other, and they're actually much, much healthier and robust when they're growing in diverse plant communities than when they're growing in a monoculture. But even in a monoculture, it can tie the root systems together, and it allows them to communicate through the roots. But they've also done these studies where they didn't allow the root systems to touch. They had them in separate pots, and it still was able to communicate whatever signal it was that it was under attack, because it sends these volatile chemicals through the air. And if you've ever been out in a field and you can just smell the plants, or especially if you kind of rub the plant, and you can it's leaves are very aromatic when you crush them. Part of what's happening is it's releasing these scents because it's under attack. You're there squishing it, you're rubbing it around. It doesn't know what's happening. It thinks it's under attack. It will release these perfumes, if you will, and it not only signals other plants, but it can signal insects as well. And what happens is the insects can pick up on these scents that the plants are giving out, and it's like calling in an airstrike. So when a plant gets infested by an aphid, it will release this perfume that the predator insects like lady beetles and lacewings and syrphid flies, they can detect that, and then they can be drawn into the plant where the aphid is. But it doesn't do you any good if you don't have any of those things out there. That's a whole nother talk. So plants communicate with insects as well as with each other. And again, the level of sophistication of communication that's going on within the system is very, very high, but most of it is driven through the biology. And when we reduce the biology, when we eliminate the biology in our system, guess what? Plants don't communicate with each other nearly as well. And then they're more susceptible to diseases. They're more susceptible to insect attacks. So then we have to put on fungicides and we have to put on insecticides. And again, we still do that on our farm. We're still trying to learn too, but we're moving in the right direction. Lastly, defense and protection. Again, the plant soil economy needs to be protected because there's always going to be things that want to attack it. And it's not always just bad things. We couldn't grow plants without water, but we have to protect our system from water because you've all seen the picture of the destructive impact of a raindrop. On bare soil, it looks like a bomb exploding. So we need water, but we have to protect against water. And not just too much water, but also too little. We have to mitigate the drought factor. We have to mitigate the destructive impact of a rainfall. We have to protect against the wind from the Dust Bowl. We can't allow that to happen again. We can't let it get too hot or too cold or too compacted or too many weeds or too many insects. There are all sorts of things that we need to protect our economy from because there's lots of things out there that want to attack our economy. So I'm going to just share 5 ways that our economy gets protected. Number one is it's real simple. Keep the soil covered. Keep the soil covered. It's one of the easiest things to do, but it's also one of the most important because if you have bare soil, just about everything else is not going to work. Doesn't matter what else you try to do, it's not going to work. And I've seen guys that have been no-tilled for years and years and years, and when they go out there and they bale up all the residue and haul it off, it doesn't matter. No-till is worthless. That ground will blow, that ground will erode, just like conventional tillage. Rolf Derpsch, who was our tour guide when we were in Brazil, he has this to say. And he's one of the godfathers of the South American no-till movement, and they're quite a ways ahead of the United States, I would say, in what they're doing. But he says almost all advantages of the no-till system come from the permanent cover of the soil, and only a few of the advantages come from not tilling the soil. Always aim at full soil cover. So if you're organic and you need to do some tillage because that's your only option to kill something, do it so that you maintain as much cover as possible because the physical act of disturbing the soil is not as destructive as the fact that you may bury too much residue. You have to keep the soil covered. That's your first line of defense against many of the things that would attack your system. Number 2 is plant signaling. We already kind of talked about this. Again, this is an article from the Scientist magazine that has a whole article about how plants communicate. It's really, really fascinating. But again, if you don't have the biology, many of these things aren't going to happen, and you'll be much more susceptible to diseases. Thirdly is just have healthy plants. Healthy soil produces healthy plants. Healthy plants produce more and more sophisticated compounds. And this is a slide that I stole from Willie Durham, who's the NRCS soil health specialist in Texas. And he's showing that the lowest level of plant growth is just photosynthesizing. All plants are going to do this, okay? This is the lowest level, and it's just basically forming that glucose molecule, okay? Nothing special, all plants do that. As you move up this pyramid, the the compounds that the plants are making become more and more complex. So you go from just the photosynthates to complex proteins, fats, lipids, and oils, to all the way up to the plant's secondary metabolites. And what he's showing is that as plants get healthier, they produce more and more sophisticated molecules. Insects cannot digest these sophisticated molecules. They'll eat glucose all day long. And that's why they'll just tear your plants apart if all they're doing is photosynthesis. But as plants get healthier and they produce more of these proteins, fats, lipids, and oils, they become just naturally resistant to these insects because the insects cannot digest these complex molecules. So having healthy soils will grow healthy plants. They will become naturally resistant to many of the insects that are out there. Number 4 is symbiotic relationships between plants and organisms. This is a picture from my friends at the Noble Research Institute. This is a plant root. The little squiggly lines that you see running through there is an endophyte fungus. This is not mycorrhizal fungus. This is endophytes. What it does is it grows inside the plant roots. It's a symbiotic relationship. The plant gives it carbon to keep that fungus alive. The fungus is providing different compounds which protect the plant from disease. It makes plants much more drought hardy, much more resistant to diseases. So they're experimenting with these different endophyte funguses that plants will utilize to do that. And the 5th thing is just simply being diverse. You know, most things are going to want to attack a single plant or a single thing or maybe 2. But when you have a very diverse cover crop mix like this, even if I have insects come in, they're going to eat some of that, but the rest of it, they're going to go, I don't know what to do with this. And so diversity always leads to resilience. Diversity always leads to less risk. And so when you're diverse, not only in your cash crop rotations, but when you're diverse in your cover crops, you'll have a much higher level of protection. So if you have the opportunity to plant a cover crop and the conditions allow it, and tomorrow I'm going to be talking about cover crop mixes and some different ways to do that. If you have the time to do a diverse mix, you should always do a diverse mix. Now, if it's middle of October, you may plant cereal rye and call it good. We do a lot of that. Our theory is more is better than less, but something is better than nothing. So we always want to plant a diverse mix, but if it doesn't make sense, plant something. But if it does make sense, plant a diverse mix. So there's the keys to a healthy soil. Those 7 things, if we can do those things, we'll really see our economy grow. And I've got 8 takeaway points that I'll cover just here in just a few minutes to kind of sum this whole thing up, and then we'll get to some question time. Number 1, economies are intricately interconnected and they're interdependent. And you cannot mess with one thing in this economy without affecting everything else. And what we've done by and large as farmers, and we're as guilty as anyone, is we have removed the biology and that has messed up everything else. And so we have to step in with these massive welfare programs with a jug, with a chemical applicator, whatever it is. We've broken the system when we take the biology out. Number 2, we need to figure out how to reduce. I don't know that we'll ever completely eliminate. Well, I shouldn't say that. Most of us, probably ourselves included, will probably not ever completely eliminate all inputs. Some people are doing it, and that's great. But most of us, we can all reduce. We can all reduce the amount of welfare that we're giving to our economy, get everyone working, particularly the biology. So focus on what can you change in your farming system in this upcoming year that will promote biological activity in your soil. Maybe something as simple as diversifying your rotation. Maybe it's reducing commercial fertilizer and using more compost. I don't know what it might be for your operation, but focus on the biology and a lot of these other things will come into place. You'll reduce the amount of welfare you have to give as you increase the amount of biology that you have. Your banker is always worried about your cash flow. Next time you go in, talk about your cash flow of carbon. And you want to increase your cash flow of carbon. Did you know that if you're growing corn and soybeans, you're only about 50% efficient in capturing solar energy? Your cash flow is half of what it could be if you use cover crops. So less than 50% efficient with a corn-soybean rotation, But if we start putting in cereal rye and grazing cattle and doing things like this, all of a sudden we can capture so much more solar energy and CO2, and that combination is putting carbon into the soil. Now all of a sudden we start seeing organic matter levels rise. The carbon is going to flow much more readily, and when we have excess currency, we can store it, we can invest it into long-term savings, which is that soil organic matter. And when we can build that soil organic matter through cover crops, through cattle, through more diverse rotations, if you've gone to all the work of making those investments, don't sell off those investments by hitting it with a plow or baling up that residue and hauling it away. Now, I know if you're organic, I say you have to do some tillage, but reduce it as much as you can. If you're not organic, you probably have to use some chemicals. Reduce it as much as you can. There's ways to reduce, but we got to figure out what they are. But don't sell off those investments by doing these things. Number 5, take advantage of all the free tiny little workers. The biology, they literally will work for carbon. They don't work for peanuts, but they'll work for carbon, and they provide so many services. Manufacturing of nitrogen, mining of all these other things, transportation, communication, protection. I don't think we fully grasp and realize the importance of what the biology can do within our system, largely because we can't see them. And what we can't see, we often tend to overlook. And what we don't see, we often don't understand. So again, focus on how we can get more biological diversity into our system, because they provide so many of these critical services that we need. Build and do not destroy infrastructure. You will really see your economy grow. Again, farm in ways that will promote mycorrhizal fungi, farm in ways that will promote earthworms, and when you build up these infrastructures like this, don't come in and do this. Because I said a wartime strategy is trying to destroy infrastructure. So when you pull a big old disc or a moldboard plow through your soil, you literally are declaring war on your soil. Number 7, protect your economy with soil armor. Do what it takes to keep the soil covered. Very important. Can't overstress that enough, because none of these other things are going to work. I say you could be no-till all your life, and if you leave that soil bare, it's going to go downhill so fast, it's not going to matter that you had 20 years of no-till behind you. It doesn't matter if you leave it exposed. It's going to blow away. It's going to wash away. It's going to get too hot. It's going to get too cold. It's going to crust. It's going to compact. All bad things happen to bare soil. Some bad things happen to covered soil, but all the bad things happen to bare soil. So protect your economy with soil armor. And lastly, again, focus on diversity. If you're just doing corn and soybeans, think about how you can get more diversity into your system. Wheat's not that great right now with the economy, economics of wheat. I understand that, but you need to look at more than just the money that wheat is bringing in. You need to look at what can you do after wheat. Can I double crop? Can I do a grazing crop and bring in cattle? It allows you to do that big cover crop that you can never do after corn and soybeans. Think about more ways to bring diversity back to the farm. Our forefathers had very diverse farms. They had to, because they didn't have government programs. They didn't have insurance programs to prop us up. They had to be diverse because that's the only way they could manage risk. We don't have to manage, we have other mechanisms to manage risk, so by and large, we've lost the diversity. Figure out how to bring it back, because with diversity, the biology will return. And when that returns, then the whole economy gets put back to the way that it should be. So, I don't know how much more you understand now, but it's a very, very complicated system. And our economy is too, but we understand the economy because that's where we live every day. So hopefully some of these analogies that I talked about will help you understand what's going on in the soil. So thank you for your attention, and we have time for questions. So I love this. Usually when I get to do this talk, I only have an hour. I don't ever have time for questions, so I'm excited about questions. So what do you got? Yes? Okay, so the question is, mycorrhizal fungi, we know it's good. How much damage does tillage do to mycorrhiza? Quite a bit. But it can be overcome. Yes. So because the mycorrhiza forms such a vast network, when you're going in there and chopping it up, let me put it this way. Tillage is bad for mycorrhiza, but so is fallow ground. If you have a long period of time when nothing's growing, even if you're not doing any tillage, fallow ground, mycorrhiza will die off just as fast as they will with tillage. So the key is when you till something, get something else growing as fast as you can, because you won't completely destroy the mycorrhiza, but tillage in combination with a fallow period will make a lot of it die off. So the key to responding to tillage is to have another set of living roots growing as fast as you possibly can, because mycorrhiza is very unique among biological organisms because it can jump from one host to another. And it's pretty non-selective. The only thing that really won't use mycorrhiza, most all of your brassicas, so I would never recommend anybody to plant a cover crop that was only brassicas. Radishes, turnips, rapeseed, mustards, any of those, because they don't need mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza won't grow on those roots. So when you're growing a brassica-only cover crop, you're doing zero to build up your mycorrhizal population. So always have a grass in there. Almost all grasses are very mycorrhizal. Legumes, they're great. Flax, sunflowers, all those plants, highly mycorrhizal. That's why the diversity of your mixes is very important. So if you're doing tillage because you're organic, I understand that, get something else growing as soon as possible. Tillage and fallow periods are the two worst things. Never combine both of them together. Other questions? Yes? Yeah, so the question was, how are we going to reduce the inputs on our own farm? What are we going to do there? Number one, we purchased composting equipment. We have access to quite a bit of feedlot manure. We had been using feedlot manure, always led to an increase in productivity, really liked what it did, always led to huge amounts of weeds as well. Big problem. So the composting equipment allows us to condition that manure, to heat it up to the proper temperatures, to sterilize those weed seeds. So now we're applying conditioned manure. But in addition, we're still learning because we've only had this for about a year. We're also trying to build humus compost, which only has a very small percentage of manure, but it has. We've also got access to lots of wood chips. I showed a picture of never bale up your corn stalks, but I guess what I really should say, never bale up your corn stalks, but if your neighbor is going to, don't be afraid to buy them. Is that bad? Well, I just as well buy them as the feedlot. You can buy carbon pretty cheap because people don't understand the value of it. So we're bringing in corn stalk bales, soybean stalk bales, wood chips, different things like that. From our seed cleaning operation with green cover seed, we generate thousands of bushels of just waste coming off the cleaner. So we're starting to compost all of that seed cleanings and things like that. And those have a lot of weed seeds as well, so it's important to be composted. So conditioned manure, humus compost, we feel like with those things we'll be able to greatly reduce the amount of commercial fertilizer we have to put out there. Number three, we have increased the amount of cattle that we have. We've always had like 30 cows, just enough to kind of be a hassle because we only had about 120 acres of grass, so that's about all it would support. Well, now we're up to about 130 cows, and we still only have 120 acres of grass. So what we're doing is we're forcing ourselves to kind of put our money where our mouth is because we're going to have to support all of these cattle on our crop ground. And so we're looking at changing our rotation. So now instead of doing 112-day corn, we may be doing 95-day corn so that we can either get it out early to plant something to graze, or I can graze something all the way through June 15th and then plant short season corn. Or we may, we're going to start planting more things like buckwheat. German millet, things like that, that I can grow a crop in 75 days, so that especially in our irrigated ground, our goal is to always take a cash crop and to take a grazing forage crop off in the same year. Some years we can do that with the dry land, some years we may not. So we're bringing lots more cattle numbers in, because when you harvest with cattle, 80% of the nutrients that go in one end of the cow is going to come back out the other end and stay in your field. When you harvest with a combine, 100% of the nutrients that go in that truck never come back unless you're hauling manure back in, which, you're not going to go to New York City and bring back, the waste from the food that you're providing. So cattle are a much less negative impact on nutrient export, so you have to have far fewer nutrient inputs to balance the system out. So those are two things: reducing the amount of herbicides, again, changing the rotation. We can manage weeds far, far better with cattle than we can with long season crops. The short season crops, every time I harvest something, I have an opportunity to cut the weeds off, and so I can do some weed control that way. I don't know. There's, Palmer amaranth it's kicking our butt like everybody else, and it's going to continue to be a big issue. So we're trying to figure out different rotations. We have in the past have had about 1,600 to 1,800 acres of corn and soybeans. This year we'll plant less than 1,000 acres combined of corn and soybeans. We're going to more of these specialty type things. We have an advantage because I have a market for them. But there are markets out there if you look for them. There's good markets for sunflowers. There's markets for some of these other things. So we're gonna greatly diversify what we do. So those are some of the things. How far down the path? I don't know. Invite me back in 3 years. Maybe I can report on it. Somebody back here had their hand up. Yeah. Yeah, we're finding that out. Yeah, so the question is composting just another form of welfare, because it is a high input type system, as opposed to growing the cover crop out there, properly grazing it, and basically letting it compost itself in the field? That's an excellent point. I think compost is going to be, I guess, kind of transitional welfare, if you will, because especially on some of these soils that have been so beat up for so many years, you're going to need some intermediate steps before you can get to the Gabe Brown method, if you will, where there's virtually zero inputs, doing it all just through the plant. That can be done. It can be a really hard transition period, especially if your ground is really beat up. The compost, I think, gives a intermediate step to get there. I don't think it's practical to put all of your nutrients on through compost every year, because it is expensive. We're fairly fortunate because we have a lot of the raw ingredients fairly close. The biggest cost in compost is all in transport. And so if you have manure, if you have corn stalks, if you have wood chips, if you have all that close and your fields aren't that far away, then that can be manageable. But yeah, if you got to haul that very far, it's crushing. But I think it's going to help us get the biology ramped up to the point faster than without it. And for people that either don't have cattle or are unwilling to bring cattle in, compost kind of is like bringing cattle to the field, because cattle deposit incredible amounts of biology into the soil. When you never have cattle or other livestock on your fields, you miss out on that whole component of additional biology. You can replace much of that with the right type of compost. But you have to, composting it's not, conditioning manure is easy. You just go turn it when it needs to be, and making good compost is really hard. And it's expensive, and yeah, I think it needs to be used in small amounts. But I think it will help us get to where we want to go faster. But there's definitely, if you can grow it in the field and let the cattle process it in, that's by far the best way, but it's probably not going to be practical for everyone. Somebody over here had a question. Yes? The question is, what application method are we using with our compost? Right now, we're using a litter spreader, and so we're putting it in the litter. It's not a manure spreader, but a litter spreader, because the compost spreads much better with that than a regular manure spreader. So we're using that and spreading. With the composted manure, we're putting probably 5 or 6 tons out. When we make the humus compost, we'll probably only put 1 ton to 2 tons per acre of that out. The other thing that we're going to do is start making compost tea. Once we can make that really high-grade humus compost, then we'll extract some of the biology through a tea making process, and that we will apply through our pivots. And we're going to start using that as starter fertilizer instead of a phosphate-based fertilizer. In the tea making process, yeah, the question was, will we inject oxygen into the tea making process? Yes. Because, yeah, you start with the compost, you add all of the enzymes and the food package, hit it with oxygen, and then you got to get it on right away. But so every pivot that we have is set up for fertigation, so we can run that compost tea right through the pivots. We think that's going to be a great way to get it on. Yes? So the question is, if you don't have access to compost and some of this stuff, what do I think of biochar? I have not read anything about biochar that I haven't liked. The thing with biochar, and I think biochar with compost is a great thing, because biochar has so much surface area in it. If you look at it under a microscope, it's got all these crystals, and it's a really, really unique type of carbon. And what all that surface area does is it gives all of this different habitat for the biology to grow in. And so, carbon is not the same from source to source. Biochar is one of the best because of the huge amounts of surface area and a very small amount of biochar. So biochar by itself isn't going to do anything because there's not enough carbon to really make a difference into the system. The value comes when you have the biochar and the biology, because it gives the biology a place to grow. The populations will grow and explode much faster because it's great habitat for it. So don't use biochar if you're not doing other things that are going to increase the amount of biological activity in the soil. But when used together, I think, again, it can get you to where you want to go faster. And again, are you thinking about making your own biochar, or you've got a source somewhat close? Yeah. The thing with biochar is the application rates can be pretty low. But again, I think it would be I don't think it would be worth the money to put biochar on if you're not also doing something to increase the biological levels, because there's no way there's enough carbon in the biochar itself to make a significant difference. The difference comes in providing the habitat for the biology. At least that's what I know. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know if everybody heard that or not. He said one of the reasons that we've lost so much organic matter from the soil is because it's been, basically farmed out and traded in for other types of production. And that's very true. It doesn't have to be that way, but it often is that way. And we can we can start to rebuild and replace that, and I've got a whole nother talk on rebuilding our soils. But that's a very valid point, is that we've lost a lot of organic matter in the pursuit of production. And the other question, or the other statement or thought is, Colorado State University person said that organic matter is largely the dead and decomposing bodies of biology more so than plants. I think there's some of both. I have heard that statement said as well. I don't know if I completely buy into that, because when you, especially like if you grow a big cover crop, you just look at all the massive amounts of residue out there. I can't help but think that a lot of that is going to end up as organic matter. Now, the point they may be making is that just like this, the way the system was created is everything goes through the biology when it's coming out of the soil, but I think it's the same way when it goes in. So for the carbon in a plant to form into carbon in the soil, it needs to go through the biology to get there. And so if you had all the plant material in the world, is it going to turn into organic matter? Very, very slowly. And I know this because when we were no-tilling, when we converted from conventional farming to no-till farming, there was a point in time when we could see 4 years worth of plant residues on top of the soil. I could go back and look, and I could see the different crops that we grew, because we weren't tilling it anymore, but we also didn't have the biology in the soil to decompose it. And so we were building up this thatch layer. So there's a period of time in no-till where you're going to struggle with too much residue. Once you get the biology in there, and if we would have been using cover crops in the beginning, we would not have had that problem because they would have enhanced my biology. Now we have the opposite. We can grow 250 bushel corn stalks and have bare soil in May because the biology just consumes it so fast. And so they're probably right, but it's not. You need both because the biology has to eat the carbon the plant's making, but in order for the carbon to get into organic matter, it has to run through the biology. So I would agree with that, but I don't think it's quite a complete statement without having all that information.